You're overreacting, Jessica. It's just another business trip, Marcus said, barely glancing up from his laptop screen as he packed his designer leather briefcase. The dismissive tone in his voice made my stomach clench, but I forced myself to smile anyway. My name is Jessica, and I'm 34 years old, living what most people would consider a comfortable life in Charlotte, North Carolina. My husband Marcus works as a regional sales director for BioCorp Solutions, a pharmaceutical consulting company, while I manage our household and work part-time as a freelance graphic designer. For 7 years, we'd built what I thought was a solid marriage based on trust, shared goals, and mutual respect. Marcus traveled frequently for work, sometimes staying away for 3 or 4 days at a time, visiting clients across the Southeast. I never questioned it because his job provided us with a beautiful home in the suburbs, 2 luxury vehicles, and enough financial security that I could pursue my creative passions without the pressure of a full-time corporate position. But lately, something felt different. Marcus had become more secretive about his phone, more dismissive when I asked about his trips, and strangely defensive whenever I mentioned wanting to visit him during one of his work conferences. When I suggested joining him for his upcoming Miami conference, thinking it could be like a mini vacation for us, his reaction was immediate and harsh. "Absolutely not," he'd snapped. "This isn't a vacation, Jessica. I'll be in meetings from morning until night. You'd just be sitting alone in a hotel room, bored out of your mind." His words stung more than they should have. We used to travel together all the time when we were first married. He'd encourage me to come along on his shorter business trips, and we'd make little adventures out of them. Now, the idea seemed to genuinely irritate him. "I wouldn't mind," I'd said softly. "I could work on my designs, maybe explore the area while you're busy. We haven't had any time together lately." "The company doesn't pay for spouses," he'd replied curtly, shoving another shirt into his suitcase. "And frankly, I need to focus on work, not worry about entertaining you." The conversation had ended there, but the dismissal lingered in my chest like a bruise. When had I become such a burden to him? When had my presence shifted from welcome to unwelcome? Now watching him pack for yet another 3-day trip to Miami, I felt that familiar knot of unease tightening in my stomach. He moved with practiced efficiency, folding his best suits, packing his cologne, even including the expensive watch I'd given him for his last birthday. For a work conference, he seemed awfully concerned about his appearance. "Which hotel did you say you'd be staying at again?" I asked casually, pretending to organize some papers on my desk. "The same one as always," he replied without looking at me. "The Ocean Vista Resort. You know, the one where the pharmaceutical conferences are usually held." I nodded, though something about his tone felt rehearsed. "And you'll be back Friday evening?" "Late Friday night, probably." "Don't wait up." He zipped his suitcase closed with more force than necessary. "I really need this trip to go smoothly, Jessica. The company has been making some changes, and I need to prove my value to the regional clients." The way he emphasized need made me look up at him more carefully. Marcus was successful at his job, consistently one of the top performers in his division. What changes was he talking about? And why hadn't he mentioned them before? "Is everything okay at work?" I asked. "You seem more stressed about this trip than usual." For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Anxiety, guilt. But it disappeared so quickly I might have imagined it. "Everything's fine. Just the usual corporate pressures. Nothing for you to worry about. Nothing for me to worry about." That phrase had become his standard response to any question about his work, his trips, or frankly most aspects of our life together. When had he started treating me like a child who couldn't handle adult concerns? After he left for the airport that Thursday morning, I found myself wandering through our house, feeling strangely unsettled. The silence felt heavier than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Marcus's behavior had been off for months now, but I'd attributed it to work stress, maybe a midlife adjustment period. But watching him pack with such careful attention to his appearance, seeing the way he'd avoided my eyes when I asked about the hotel, I felt a creeping suspicion I didn't want to acknowledge. I tried to focus on my design work, a logo project for a small restaurant chain, but my concentration kept drifting. Finally, I gave up and decided to do something I'd never done before. I opened my laptop and looked up the Ocean Vista Resort in Miami. The website showed a beautiful upscale property with pristine pools, manicured gardens, and elegant conference facilities. It looked exactly like the kind of place where pharmaceutical companies would hold their regional meetings. But as I scrolled through the photos, something nagged at me. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way Marcus had packed his best clothes, or how he'd been so adamant about me not coming along, or the defensive way he'd answered my simple questions. Maybe it was the accumulation of months of feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. Whatever it was, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I started planning a surprise visit. Friday morning, I found myself standing in front of my closet, trying to decide what to wear for the 4-hour drive to Miami. I settled on a casual but flattering sundress, something that would transition well from travel to dinner, assuming Marcus would be free to spend the evening with me. My hands shook slightly as I packed an overnight bag, and I had to keep reminding myself that this was my husband, that showing up to surprise him shouldn't feel like such a risk. The drive through Georgia and into Florida gave me too much time to think. I kept rehearsing what I'd say when I found him, imagining his surprised smile, the way he'd probably laugh and shake his head at my spontaneity. "You're crazy," he'd say, but in the fond way he used to when we were first dating. We'd have dinner together, maybe spend some time by the pool, and I'd remember why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. But another part of my mind, a part I tried to silence, kept whispering darker possibilities. What if he wasn't alone? What if there was a reason he'd been so insistent that I not come? What if the growing distance between us wasn't just about work stress? I pushed those thoughts away and focused on the road ahead, watching the landscape shift from pine forests to tropical palms as I approached Miami. The Ocean Vista Resort was easy to find, a sprawling complex of low buildings surrounded by palm trees and tropical flowers. The parking lot was full, which made sense for a conference weekend, and I felt some of my anxiety ease. This was exactly what Marcus had described, a professional event in a business-appropriate setting. At the front desk, a cheerful woman in her 20s smiled at me. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for my husband," I said, trying to sound casual. "Marcus Patterson. He's here for the pharmaceutical conference." The woman typed something into her computer, then frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any pharmaceutical conferences scheduled this weekend." My heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure?" "He said he was staying here for a Biocorp Solutions conference." She checked again, then shook her head. "No corporate events at all this weekend. We do have a guest registered under that name, though. Room 312. The blood rushed in my ears as I tried to process what she'd just told me. No conference, no business event. Just Marcus staying at an expensive resort hotel, apparently for reasons he'd lied to me about. "Could you please call his room?" I managed to ask. "I'd like to surprise him." "Of course." She dialed the extension and waited. After a few rings, she hung up. "No answer, I'm afraid. Would you like to leave a message?" "No, that's fine. I'll just go up and wait for him." I managed what I hoped was a normal smile. We were supposed to meet for dinner anyway. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt endless. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding about the conference. Maybe it had been moved or canceled. Maybe Marcus had decided to take a personal day and hadn't wanted to worry me. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd learned at the front desk, I knew something was very wrong. Room 312 was at the end of the hallway, and I stood outside the door for several minutes, my hand raised to knock but unable to follow through. Part of me wanted to turn around, drive home, and pretend this had never happened. But I'd come too far to back down now. I knocked softly. No answer. I knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. Finally, I tried the door handle, not really expecting it to turn. It did. The door swung open to reveal a hotel room that was clearly occupied. Marcus's suitcase was open on the luggage rack, his clothes scattered around the room with an unusual carelessness that didn't match his normally meticulous habits. The bed was unmade, and I could smell expensive perfume in the air, something floral and heavy that definitely wasn't mine. My legs felt weak as I stepped into the room, looking around with growing disbelief. On the nightstand, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A room service receipt, crumpled but still readable. The timestamp showed it was from the night before Thursday evening. The order was for 2 dinners, 2 bottles of wine, and chocolate-covered strawberries. Dinner for 2. As I stood there holding the receipt, my hands trembling, I heard it. The sound of running water from the bathroom and voices, female laughter. The shower was running and Marcus wasn't alone. I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of trust and shared dreams and plans for the future. And I was standing in a hotel room listening to my husband shower with a woman I didn't know, a woman he'd apparently had dinner with the night before. I should have left. I should have walked out of that room, driven home, and confronted him when he returned. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, holding that damning receipt, listening to my marriage dissolve in real time. The water shut off and the voices grew clearer. I heard Marcus's laugh, followed by a woman saying something about next time and the usual arrangement. That's when I realized I had 2 choices. I could run, or I could finally learn the truth about what my husband had been doing during all those business trips. I chose the truth. I moved quickly but quietly to the closet near the bathroom, positioning myself behind the partially open door where I could see without being seen. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain everyone in the room would hear it. But I forced myself to stay calm and focused. Whatever was about to happen, I needed to see it clearly, to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The bathroom door opened and Marcus emerged first, wearing one of the hotel's thick white robes. He looked relaxed and satisfied in a way I hadn't seen from him in months. Behind him came a woman, probably in her mid-20s, strikingly beautiful, wearing a matching hotel robe that barely covered her thighs. She moved with a casual familiarity that spoke of routine, of an arrangement that had clearly happened many times before. "Same time next month?" she asked, her voice carrying a professional tone. "Absolutely," Marcus replied, pulling out his wallet. "The 20th through 22nd, just like always," the woman laughed. "You know, Marcus, most of my regulars don't book me for entire weekends. You must really love your business trips," Marcus chuckled, counting out what looked like several $100 bills. "What can I say? I believe in work-life balance." I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making any sound. Regulars. This wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a pattern, a routine that had been going on for months, maybe years. "Your wife still doesn't suspect anything?" the woman asked, accepting the money Marcus handed her. "Jessica?" Marcus's voice carried a dismissive tone that made my skin crawl. "She's completely clueless, too busy with her little art projects to pay attention to anything important. As long as I tell her it's business, she believes whatever I say." The woman started getting dressed, pulling on expensive-looking lingerie that definitely hadn't come from any department store. "That must be nice, having someone so trusting." "It has its advantages," Marcus agreed. "She handles all the domestic stuff, keeps the house running, never asks too many questions about my expenses. Perfect setup, really. I felt physically sick." The casual way he dismissed me, reduced 7 years of marriage to convenient domestic services, made me want to storm out of the closet and confront both of them. But something held me back. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was a survival instinct telling me I needed more information before I acted. "Speaking of expenses," the woman said, now fully dressed in a designer outfit, "you're still running everything through your company, right? Same credit cards?" Marcus nodded. "Corporate card for all entertainment expenses. My company has very generous policies about client relations." My blood turned to ice. He was using his company credit cards for this. Not only was my husband cheating on me with escorts, but he was committing fraud to pay for it. The implications hit me like a truck. If he was charging these expenses to Biocorp Solutions, he was stealing from his employer, and as his spouse, I could potentially be held liable for tax fraud on our joint returns. How long have you been doing this? The woman asked, checking her appearance in the mirror. About 2.5 years now, Marcus replied casually. Started with just local arrangements, but the out-of-town trips are so much better. More discreet, and the company pays for the hotel anyway. 2.5 years. He'd been systematically lying to me, cheating on me, and committing corporate fraud for over 2 years. Every business trip, every conference, every time he'd brushed off my questions or insisted I couldn't come along, he'd been protecting this elaborate deception. After the woman left, Marcus moved around the room with practiced efficiency, gathering the scattered clothes, straightening the bed, opening the windows to air out the perfume smell. He was obviously experienced at covering his tracks, at eliminating evidence of what had happened here. How many times had he done this exact routine? How many lies had he told me over the years? I remained hidden in the closet, barely breathing, as I watched him prepare to return to his normal life, to come home to me with stories about boring conferences and difficult clients. The man I'd thought I knew, the man I'd built a life with, was a complete stranger. Worse than a stranger, he was a criminal who had been using our marriage as cover for his illegal activities. But as I watched him methodically erase the evidence of his betrayal, something shifted inside me. The initial shock and devastation began to crystallize into something else entirely. Cold, calculating anger. Marcus thought I was clueless, too trusting, too naive to figure out what he was really doing. He thought he could continue this charade indefinitely, stealing from his company, lying to me, treating our marriage like a convenient facade. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I waited until he went into the bathroom to shower again. Then I quietly slipped out of the closet and began taking photos with my phone. The rumpled bed, the room service receipt still lying on the nightstand, the champagne glasses still sitting on the dresser. I photographed everything, making sure to capture the room number, the timestamp on the receipt, any evidence that would prove what had happened here. Then I slipped out of the room and headed for the elevator, my mind already working on my next steps. Marcus had made a crucial mistake when he assumed I was too stupid to figure out his game. But I wasn't the naive woman he thought he'd married. I was about to become his worst nightmare. I drove home from Miami in a strange state of focused calm that surprised me. The 4-hour journey gave me time to process what I'd witnessed and begin formulating a plan. By the time I pulled into our driveway in Charlotte, I knew exactly what I needed to do. And the first step was gathering evidence. Marcus wouldn't be home until late that night, which gave me several hours to search through our financial records without interruption. I'd never paid much attention to the details of our joint accounts or his business expenses, trusting him to handle the financial side of our marriage while I focused on my design work and managing our household. That trust, I now realized, had been a massive mistake. I started with our home office, a room I rarely entered since Marcus had claimed it as his private workspace years ago. His desk was meticulously organized, with neat stacks of business papers and expense reports filed in labeled folders. As I began going through the documents, a pattern quickly emerged that made my stomach churn. The corporate credit card statements told a story I'd never imagined. Monthly charges at high-end hotels in cities across the Southeast, always for extended stays that coincided with Marcus's business trips. Restaurant bills for expensive dinners that were always charged for multiple people. Charges at luxury spas, expensive boutiques, even jewelry stores, all categorized as client entertainment or business development. Expenses, but it was the consulting, service charges that made the picture crystal clear, monthly payments ranging from $500 to $4,000 to companies with names like Premium Client Services, Elite Business Solutions, and Coastal Hospitality Consultants. The amounts were staggering. When I added them up over the past 2.5 years, the total came to over $70,000 in fraudulent expenses. My hands were shaking as I photographed each document with my phone, creating a comprehensive record of Marcus's systematic theft from his employer. This wasn't just adultery. This was felony embezzlement on a massive scale. And because we filed joint tax returns, I could potentially be held liable as an accomplice if the authorities decided I should have known about the fraud. I moved to Marcus's computer next, surprised to find it wasn't password protected. His overconfidence in my supposed ignorance had made him careless about security. His email revealed even more damning evidence: correspondence with escort agencies, detailed arrangements for his monthly business trips, casual discussions about services and prices that read like ordering from a catalog. One email chain particularly caught my attention. It was from 4 months ago, between Marcus and someone named Sophia, who appeared to be a booking coordinator for one of the escort services. Marcus had been complaining about having to be more creative with his expense categorizations because his company had started requiring more detailed justifications for entertainment expenses. "Don't worry about it," Sophia had replied. "We can provide you with detailed consulting invoices that will pass any audit. Our clients in corporate positions need discretion, and we're very good at providing the right paperwork." The escort service was actively helping him commit fraud, providing fake invoices and consultation agreements that would allow him to steal from his employer while covering his tracks. This wasn't just personal betrayal. This was organized criminal activity that had been going on right under everyone's nose for years. As I continued searching through his files, I found something that made my blood run cold: a detailed budget spreadsheet that showed exactly how much money Marcus was stealing each month and how he was using it. The amounts weren't just for the escort services themselves. He was padding his expense reports with fake meals, fictional client gifts, and inflated hotel charges, skimming thousands of extra dollars each month that went into a separate bank account I'd never known existed. The secret account statements showed a balance of over $35,000 money. He'd been systematically stealing from BioCorp Solutions and hiding from me. I sat back in his desk chair, overwhelmed by the scope of his deception. This wasn't just about cheating or even corporate fraud. Marcus had been living an entirely separate life, funded by stolen money, while using our marriage as a convenient cover story. I was nothing more than a prop in his elaborate criminal enterprise, the naive wife whose presence made him appear stable and trustworthy to his employers and colleagues. But as devastating as these discoveries were, they also gave me something powerful: leverage. Marcus had no idea that I knew about any of this. He thought he was coming home to the same oblivious wife who would smile and ask about his business conference, who would believe whatever lies he told about his successful meetings with clients. I spent the rest of the afternoon making copies of everything, uploading documents to a secure cloud storage account, and organizing the evidence into categories: corporate fraud, tax evasion, and personal betrayal. By the time I heard Marcus's car in the driveway at nearly midnight, I had built a comprehensive case against him that would destroy both his career and his freedom. The hardest part was acting normal when he walked through the door. He looked tired but satisfied, carrying himself with the same casual confidence he always displayed after his business trips. He kissed my forehead absently, the same perfunctory gesture he'd been giving me for months, and asked about my weekend in the same disinterested tone he always used. "How was the conference?" I asked, amazed at how steady my voice sounded. "Productive," he replied, loosening his tie. "Closed a major deal and made some good connections for future business. The company should be very happy with the results." The casual way he lied to my face after everything I'd discovered made me want to confront him immediately. But I forced myself to smile and nod, to play the role of the trusting wife for just a little longer. I needed more than evidence. I needed a strategy that would protect me legally while ensuring that Marcus faced the full consequences of his actions. "That's wonderful," I managed to say. "I'm proud of you for working so hard." He barely acknowledged the compliment, already heading upstairs to shower off the evidence of his weekend activities. As I listened to the water running, I realized that the man I'd married had been gone for years, replaced by a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a useful fool. But that stranger had made a crucial error in judgment. He'd underestimated exactly how smart and determined his clueless wife could be when she finally understood what she was dealing with. The next few weeks were the most challenging acting job of my life. Every morning I had to wake up beside a man who disgusted me, smile at his casual lies about his work, and pretend to be the same naive woman he thought he'd married. But while Marcus went about his routine, assuming nothing had changed, I was systematically building a case that would ensure his complete destruction, started by consulting with a divorce attorney, someone I found through careful research who specialized in cases involving financial fraud. Angela Morrison had a reputation for being ruthless in protecting her clients' interests. And when I showed her the evidence I'd gathered, her eyes lit up with professional satisfaction. "This is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've seen," she told me during our confidential consultation. "Your husband isn't just cheating. He's committed multiple felonies that could result in serious prison time." "What does that mean for me?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping me awake at night. "We filed joint tax returns. Could I be charged as an accomplice?" Angela shook her head. "Not if we handle this correctly. The key is to report the fraud before the authorities discover it on their own. If you cooperate fully and demonstrate that you were genuinely unaware of his criminal activities, you'll be protected." She outlined a strategy that was both brilliant and brutal. First, we would document everything, creating a timeline of Marcus's fraudulent activities that would be impossible for him to deny. Then, we would simultaneously file for divorce and report his crimes to both his employer and the relevant law enforcement agencies. The timing would be crucial. Marcus needed to be completely blindsided so he couldn't destroy evidence or flee. "The goal is to leave him with no options and no allies," Angela explained. "By the time he realizes what's happening, his career will be over, criminal charges will be pending, and his assets will be frozen." While working with Angela, I also began implementing my own investigation. I hired a private investigator named Robert Chen, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate fraud cases. Robert's job was to verify everything I'd discovered and to uncover any additional criminal activities I might have missed. What Robert found exceeded even my worst expectations. Marcus's fraud wasn't limited to escort services. He'd been running multiple schemes simultaneously, claiming fake travel expenses for trips he never took, submitting receipts for fictional client meals, even billing the company for personal purchases by categorizing them as office supplies or promotional materials. "Your husband has stolen well over $85,000 from his employer," Robert reported during one of our meetings. "He's been doing this so long and so systematically that he's gotten careless. There are digital footprints everywhere." The scope of Marcus's criminal activities was breathtaking. He'd been using his position at BioCorp Solutions to steal money, maintain multiple relationships, and use our marriage as cover. I wasn't just dealing with an unfaithful husband. I was married to a career criminal who had been operating right under everyone's nose. As the evidence mounted, I found myself changing in ways I hadn't expected. The devastated, betrayed wife was gradually replaced by someone harder, more calculating, more determined to see justice done. Marcus had spent years underestimating me, treating me like a decorative accessory to his real life. Now I was going to show him exactly how wrong he'd been about my capabilities. The turning point came 2 weeks after my discovery in Miami. Marcus announced another business trip, this time to Atlanta for what he claimed was a regional pharmaceutical convention. But thanks to Robert's investigation, I knew exactly what this trip really was. Another weekend with an escort service, this time using a different agency to vary his patterns. "How long will you be gone?" I asked, maintaining the same disinterested tone I'd perfected over the past month. "Just 2 nights," Marcus replied, not bothering to look up from his phone. "Should be back Wednesday evening. That gave me exactly 48 hours to execute the plan Angela and I had been developing. While Marcus was in Atlanta committing fresh crimes, I would be systematically dismantling his entire life. The night before he left, I watched him pack with the same careful attention to appearance that had first aroused my suspicions. But now I knew exactly why he took such care with his clothes and grooming. He wasn't just meeting clients. He was maintaining relationships with escort services, all of whom expected him to look the part of a successful pharmaceutical executive. "Be safe," I told him as he loaded his suitcase into his car Tuesday morning. and I meant it in a way he couldn't possibly understand. I wanted him safe until I could destroy him properly. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, I put our plan into motion. Angela had already prepared all the legal documents we would need: divorce papers citing adultery and fraud, court orders to freeze Marcus's accounts, and detailed reports to submit to law enforcement. Robert had organized all his investigative findings into a comprehensive package that would make prosecution inevitable. My first call was to BioCorp Solutions' corporate security department. I'd researched the company thoroughly and knew they took fraud very seriously, especially when it involved the theft of company resources. The security director, a man named Stephen Walsh, agreed to meet with me that afternoon after I explained that I had evidence of systematic embezzlement by one of their regional directors. The meeting was surreal. I sat in a sterile corporate conference room surrounded by executives and security personnel, while I methodically destroyed my husband's career with documents and recordings I'd gathered from his own office. Stephen and his team listened in growing amazement as I laid out the full scope of Marcus's criminal activities. "This is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases we've ever seen," Stephen said, echoing Angela's earlier assessment. "We'll need to involve federal authorities immediately." By Tuesday evening, the trap was set. Federal agents were preparing warrants, BioCorp Solutions was freezing Marcus's corporate accounts, and Angela had filed papers that would freeze our joint assets to prevent him from hiding stolen money. Marcus had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse, that his carefully constructed criminal enterprise was unraveling while he enjoyed what he thought was another successful weekend in Atlanta. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect North Carolina day, and I felt more focused and determined than I had in years. While Marcus was undoubtedly enjoying what he thought was another successful criminal venture in Atlanta, completely unaware that his world was about to implode, I was putting the finishing touches on his destruction. The federal agents arrived at our house at exactly 9:00 a.m., armed with search warrants and accompanied by investigators from BioCorp's security team. Leading the group was Agent Michael Torres, a specialist in white-collar crime who had reviewed all the evidence I'd provided and deemed it sufficient for multiple felony charges. "Mrs. Patterson," Agent Torres said as I let them into our home, "we want to thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your evidence has been invaluable in building our case against your husband." Watching federal agents systematically search through Marcus's office, seizing computers, documents, and financial records, felt like vindication for all the years I'd been dismissed and taken for granted. Every file folder they bagged as evidence, every hard drive they confiscated, represented another nail in the coffin of Marcus's arrogance. The call I'd been waiting for came at 3:00 p.m. Marcus's voice on the other end of the line sounded confused and slightly panicked, a tone I'd never heard from him before. "Jessica, something's wrong with my corporate cards," he said without preamble. "They're all being declined, and I can't access my company email." I took a deep breath, savoring the moment I'd been planning for weeks. "That's probably because BioCorp Solutions has suspended your accounts pending a fraud investigation." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought the call had disconnected. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the $70,000 you've stolen from your employer over the past 2.5 years, I said calmly. "I'm talking about the escort services you've been billing as business expenses. I'm talking about using our marriage as cover for your criminal activities." "Should I continue?" Another long silence. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had shifted from confusion to anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the bluster in his tone couldn't hide his fear. "You don't understand how business works." "I understand enough to know that you're a criminal," I replied evenly. "I also understand that federal agents are currently searching our house, that your employer has fired you, and that you're facing multiple felony charges that could send you to prison for years." I heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like him dropping his phone. When he came back on the line, his voice was pleading in a way I'd never heard before. Jessica, we need to talk. There are things you don't understand, explanations I can give you. Come to Atlanta and we can work this out together. I've already worked it out, I told him. I filed for divorce, I've reported your crimes to the authorities, and I've protected myself from your criminal liabilities. There's nothing left to discuss. You can't do this to me, Marcus's voice cracked with desperation. I'm your husband. Everything I did was for us, for our future. Everything you did was theft, I corrected him, and adultery and fraud. You did it all for yourself while treating me like a convenient fool who would provide cover for your crimes. I could hear him crying now, the first real emotion I'd heard from him in years. But it wasn't remorse for what he'd done to me or to his employer. It was self-pity because his criminal schemes had finally caught up with him. The federal agents want to speak with you, I continued. I suggest you get a good criminal defense attorney and turn yourself in before they issue a warrant for your arrest. Jessica, please, he begged. I love you. I made mistakes, but we can fix this together. You don't love me, I said with absolute certainty. You love having a wife who is too trusting to question your lies. But that woman is gone, Marcus. She died in a hotel room in Miami when she discovered what kind of man she'd really married. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked his number, cutting off his last connection to the life he'd been systematically destroying for years. The next morning brought news that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Agent Torres called at 8 a.m. to inform me that Marcus had been arrested at his Atlanta hotel while attempting to flee with nearly $45,000 in cash from his secret account. Your husband was apparently planning to disappear, Agent Torres explained. But thanks to your cooperation, we were able to track his movements and arrest him before he could leave Georgia. He's being held without bail on multiple federal charges. The image of Marcus in handcuffs, his carefully constructed facade finally stripped away, filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't expected to feel. For years, he'd treated me like I was too stupid to understand his sophisticated business dealings, too naive to recognize when I was being manipulated and lied to. Now he was learning exactly how wrong he'd been about my intelligence. Angela called an hour later with equally satisfying news about the civil proceedings. The court has frozen all of Marcus's assets, including the secret accounts he thought you didn't know about. We've also secured a judgment that protects you from any liability related to his criminal activities. But perhaps the most gratifying call came from Stephen Walsh at BioCorp Solutions. The company's internal investigation had revealed that Marcus's fraud was even more extensive than we'd initially discovered. We found evidence that your husband had been stealing from the company for over 3 years, Stephen told me. The total amount approaches $100,000 when you include all the fraudulent expenses. He single-handedly caused more financial damage to this company than any employee in our history. The scope of Marcus's criminality was staggering, but it also meant that my decision to expose him had saved BioCorp from potentially hundreds of thousands in additional losses. The company's executives were so grateful for my cooperation that they'd agreed to provide a substantial reward for information leading to Marcus's prosecution. $20,000, it's not much compared to what he stole, Stephen explained. But the board wanted to recognize that your actions prevented far greater losses. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I found myself sitting in a federal courthouse, watching my former husband plead guilty to multiple felony charges. The man who had once dismissed my intelligence and treated me like a decorative accessory was now wearing prison orange and being led away in shackles. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Marcus's attorney had already informed the court that his client was facing between 12 and 20 years in federal prison. The plea agreement required him to pay full restitution to BioCorp Solutions and surrender all assets derived from his criminal activities, including the secret accounts he'd thought I'd never discover. Judge Margaret Henderson, who was presiding over the case, made several remarks during the hearing that filled me with vindication. Mr. Patterson's crimes were not impulsive acts, but rather a systematic pattern of theft and fraud that continued for years, she said. The defendant showed a callous disregard not only for his employer's trust, but for the welfare of his own wife, who could have faced serious legal consequences for his criminal activities. As I watched Marcus accept responsibility for his crimes, I couldn't help but remember the condescending way he used to explain why I couldn't understand his work. How he dismissed my questions about his expenses and travel as naive interference in sophisticated business matters. The man who had spent years telling me I was too simple to grasp complex financial concepts was now admitting to a federal judge that he was a criminal who had defrauded his employer of nearly $100,000. After the hearing, Agent Torres approached me in the courthouse hallway with news that provided the final piece of satisfaction I needed. We've also uncovered evidence that your husband was planning to expand his operations, potentially recruiting other pharmaceutical executives into similar schemes. Your actions didn't just stop his existing crimes, they prevented a much larger criminal conspiracy. The realization that I had prevented Marcus from corrupting other people, from turning his individual criminality into an organized conspiracy, made me feel proud in a way I hadn't expected. My decision to investigate my suspicions and methodically build a case against him had protected not just BioCorp Solutions, but potentially the entire pharmaceutical industry from a sophisticated fraud ring. Angela, who had handled my divorce with the same ruthless efficiency she'd applied to protecting my legal interests, delivered the final blow to Marcus's remaining arrogance. The divorce settlement, which had been finalized the previous month, left me with the house, both vehicles, and most of our legitimate assets, while Marcus was left with nothing but his legal debts and restitution obligations. He tried to argue that you should share responsibility for his legal fees since you were the one who reported his crimes, Angela told me with obvious satisfaction. The judge literally laughed and said that expecting a crime victim to pay for her abuser's defense was the most ridiculous request she'd heard in 15 years on the bench. But perhaps the most satisfying development was how my professional life had evolved since Marcus's downfall. The publicity from my case had brought attention to my role in uncovering the fraud, and several companies reached out with consulting opportunities. BioCorp Solutions even offered me a position in their corporate security department, working specifically on fraud prevention and employee education. Your investigative skills and understanding of how financial fraud operates would be invaluable to our security team, Stephen explained during our meeting. Plus, having someone with your experience help develop training programs would send a strong message about our commitment to preventing future incidents. The irony of being offered a job by the company Marcus had stolen from was too perfect to pass up. I accepted the position, which came with a substantial salary and excellent benefits, along with the satisfaction of knowing that I was now being paid to prevent the kind of crimes my ex-husband had committed. 3 months after starting my new position, I was invited to speak at the National Association of Corporate Security Professionals annual conference in Chicago. I presented a case study based on my experience with Marcus's fraud scheme, titled "When the Threat Comes from Within: How Personal Relationships Enable Corporate Fraud." The presentation was attended by over 250 security professionals from companies across the country. Standing on that stage, explaining to an audience of experts how I had methodically uncovered and documented a sophisticated fraud scheme, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with recognizing my own capabilities. Marcus had spent years convincing me that I was intellectually inferior to him, that my contributions to our marriage were limited to domestic support and emotional labor. But in bringing down his criminal enterprise, I had demonstrated investigative skills, strategic thinking, and professional competence that impressed law enforcement agents, corporate executives, and security professionals. The speaking engagement also led to an unexpected personal development. During the conference, I met Daniel Rivers, a security consultant from Boston who had been working on a similar case involving a pharmaceutical executive who had been stealing trade secrets. Daniel was intelligent, ethical, and refreshingly straightforward in his communication. Everything that Marcus had pretended to be but never actually was. Our conversations during the conference revealed that we had similar interests in fraud prevention and corporate security, but also that we both valued honesty and mutual respect in ways that my marriage had never provided. When Daniel suggested that we stay in touch professionally and possibly personally, I realized that I was finally ready to consider what healthy relationships might look like. 4 weeks later, Daniel flew to Charlotte for what started as a business consultation, but evolved into something much more personal. For the first time in years, I found myself in conversation with a man who listened to my ideas, respected my expertise, and treated my intelligence as an asset rather than a threat. "You know," Daniel said over dinner at one of my favorite restaurants, "reading about your case was what convinced me that civilian investigators can sometimes be more effective than professional ones. You had insights into your husband's behavior that no external investigator could have developed." The compliment meant more to me than Daniel could have realized. After years of having my perceptions dismissed and my intelligence minimized, being recognized as a skilled investigator by someone whose professional opinion I respected felt like the final validation I needed. 1 year after Marcus's arrest, I received a letter forwarded through Angela from the federal detention facility where he was serving his sentence. In it, he expressed his rage at my decision to expose his crimes, accusing me of destroying what remained of his reputation for personal gain. "You didn't need to humiliate me publicly," he wrote. "Haven't you done enough damage to my life already? I'm facing over a decade in prison because of your betrayal, and now you're profiting from my destruction by speaking at conferences and working for the company I helped build." The letter was so perfectly emblematic of Marcus's narcissistic worldview that I almost laughed while reading it. Even facing federal prison for his crimes, he still saw himself as the victim and me as the villain. He couldn't comprehend that his own actions had consequences, that his years of lies and theft and betrayal had finally caught up with him through the intelligence and determination of the wife he'd spent so long underestimating. I didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing left to say to the man who had systematically betrayed me for years while dismissing my worth and intelligence. Instead, I focused on the life I was building, one based on honesty, self-respect, and genuine connections with people who valued me for who I truly was. My relationship with Daniel continued to grow, built on a foundation of mutual respect and honest communication that I'd never experienced in my marriage. My career in corporate security flourished, with regular speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that allowed me to help other companies prevent the kind of fraud Marcus had perpetrated. My freelance design work expanded as well, fueled by the confidence I'd gained through exposing Marcus's crimes and rebuilding my life on my own terms. As I stood in my home office, the same room that had once been Marcus's private workspace, now transformed into a bright creative studio, I reflected on how completely our situations had reversed. Marcus was sitting in a federal prison, facing over a decade behind bars, his reputation destroyed and his assets seized. Meanwhile, I was thriving in ways I'd never imagined possible. During our marriage, the woman he'd dismissed, as too naive to understand sophisticated business dealings, was now being paid to teach business professionals how to recognize and prevent financial fraud. The wife he'd treated as a convenient prop in his criminal enterprise had become a respected expert in corporate security, helping companies across the country protect themselves from employees like him. But more importantly, I'd discovered strengths and capabilities I never knew I possessed. I'd learned that I was far more intelligent, resourceful, and resilient than Marcus had ever given me credit for. I'd proven that sometimes the most devastating response to betrayal isn't dramatic confrontation or emotional outbursts. It's the quiet, methodical dismantling of everything the betrayer built on lies. As I looked toward my future, working in a career I loved, building a relationship based on genuine respect, and finally understanding my own worth, I realized that exposing Marcus's crimes hadn't just been about revenge or justice. It had been about reclaiming my own identity and refusing to remain the person someone else had tried to make me become. Marcus had underestimated me for the last time. And in doing so, he'd given me the greatest gift of all, the motivation to discover exactly how strong I could be when I stopped accepting someone else's diminished version of who I was. The naive, trusting wife he'd married was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth, recognized her capabilities, and refused to ever again let anyone make her feel small. And that transformation, born from betrayal and forged in the fire of exposing his crimes, was worth far more than the comfortable but hollow life I'd been living in our marriage. I was finally free. Free from his lies, free from his manipulation, and free to become the person I was always meant to be.